Good evening, everybody, and it's great to see so many people again back for another in this webinar series organized by our colleague Daniela and Tiziana from the University of Trento. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, who is Grace Lockrobin, and she is the co-director of an organization called SAPERE, a national charity that introduces educators to the ideas of philosophy for children with the intention of fostering thinking that is creative, critical, collaborative, and caring. Now, as an expert in using philosophical inquiry in schools, I think it's clear that Grace is very well placed to help us think through how we can use the knowledge that we've been gaining over the course of all these webinars, and as we try to encourage and develop the thinking skills needed for the challenge of living sustainably into the future. So Grace is going to talk for about 30 minutes with some slides, and then we'll move into breakout rooms, watch a bit of film, have a discussion before we come back for a plenary session to discuss what we've seen, what we think, and to ask more questions. So I'm not going to say any more. I'll pass over to you, Grace, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you to the University of Trento for the opportunity to be part of this series, which sounds like it's been really stimulating so far. So yeah, I'm Grace. I'm a philosopher by training, and I worked in academia for a while, but I was bitten by the bug of public philosophy, doing philosophy with publics in public places, and particularly philosophizing with children and young people. And I've been doing this work for 21 years, all of my career. And I think that the climate and eco crisis raise a particular set of issues for philosophical educators who want to develop children's thinking skills. And it's these particular questions of how to teach philosophically in an age of crisis that I want to talk you through and give you some concrete opportunities to explore what that looks like and to hear what you think about the role of philosophy in sustainability education. So it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago that the sort of horror of the climate crisis started to really get under my skin, sometime after my own kids were born. And I started to ask what's the value of a philosophical education, so my life's work, in a crisis. So I've always been interested, I think, in how philosophy might help children learn to live well. But I wanted to ask, and I started increasingly asking, how can philosophy help us to live well in this sort of strange and uncertain world? In the state of crisis, actually, what does it even mean to live well? Let me just share some slides. So this is my central question. How can philosophy help us to learn well and to live well, especially in a state of crisis? So one way of answering this question about how education can help us learn to live well, a very traditional way of answering it is to make predictions about our children's lives in the future. In fact, a lot of education is built around that. What do our kids need to know in the future to live well? And the philosopher Michael Hand says, look, children need to be equipped by education to deal effectively with at least those questions that feature in an ordinary life, prominently in an ordinary life. But there's a bit of a problem with predicting what kind of questions children need to deal with in the course of an ordinary life when the future is unpredictable and unstable. The philosopher David Kennedy says, if children are going to inhabit a world that their parents can't even imagine, how can adults prepare them for that? This is the question that's running around my brain when I start thinking about how to philosophize in the face of the climate crisis. In the next few decades, if land becomes uninhabitable, if populations of people are displaced, if food is scarce, if military conflicts escalate, what do children need to know to live well in light of that? Can it still be said that philosophy's got a role to play when we are moving into this uncertain territory? So I would say that the eco and environmental crisis, it is philosophical in nature, in part. And so I think educators like me need to speak up for the role of philosophy in facing up to the climate crisis. For some people, though, that might seem strange. They might think, well, philosophy is kind of esoteric or a kind of luxury. It's not something that you need when you're in crisis mode. But I very much disagree, and I hope I can persuade you to see things my way. The first part of defending philosophy is fairly simple, I think. Defending the importance of a philosophical education for sustainability. It's clear enough to me that there is a philosophical dimension to this interdisciplinary issue that is the climate and eco crisis. So, yeah, there are scientific questions, there are economic and technological questions, there are historical questions and geopolitical questions about the climate and eco crisis, but there's also questions about existence and meaning and value, and these are the questions that philosophy is really well placed to answer. So, these are questions like, what's wrong with extinction? When is a situation hopeless? Do the lives of future people matter as much as our lives? Philosophy can't ignore these questions, and educators can't ignore them either. And I think that young people, they need philosophical skills and dispositions, the kind of skills you need to answer questions like this wisely and well. And philosophy for children, as Mike said, P4C, I think practiced regularly, it cultivates these kind of skills that would allow students to arrive at their own provisional, meaning they could change their mind, their own provisional answers to these kinds of questions some of the time. But if any of you have any expertise in philosophical education, you'll know that a lot of the time philosophy does not supply clear answers at all. Philosophy often generates more questions. And so this could be a problem for children who are facing an uncertain future to kind of work with questions that lead to more questions and that are never quite resolved. But I would argue that the practice of doing philosophy, it shapes children intellectually, it shapes them morally, it develops in them patterns of thinking and feeling that can make them more resilient. It can make them more resilient epistemically in terms of what they know as learners. It can make them more resilient ethically. It can make them better human beings, able to face up to uncertainty and to thrive in it. So this is my position, that philosophy develops these kinds of skills and it's useful in a crisis, more so than ever. Let me just step back for a second and just say a little bit about the way I work to make a bit more sense of it. So philosophy for children is often abbreviated as P4C, philosophy for children or communities. Our work is all about creating something we call a community of philosophical inquiry. What that is a group of people, school children or others, who come together to think. We do this together because diverse perspectives shed light on conceptual problems. Because engaging in dialogue helps you understand yourself, understand other people and their differences and the world around us. Introducing P4C is about creating this community of inquiry, and it's a place where people feel safe enough to share their ideas. So these notions of sort of safety and trust are quite important when we're philosophizing about any issue, but especially about the climate and eco crisis. And Mike touched on this when he introduced me, saying that in a community of inquiry, we're interested in cultivating certain kinds of thinking. There's intellectual stuff like being critical and creative, but there's also social and emotional things like thinking in a caring and collaborative fashion. And we think that this is, in essence, the aim of what we try to do through P4C. So when we talk about the environment, why not just practice P4C, but the topic this time is the environment? Well, I think what I call environmental inquiry, which is basically P4C done about the environment and the eco crisis, it requires us in some ways to be steadfast to the normal rules and expectations of P4C, so to do P4C in an ordinary way. but it also requires us to be really quite flexible and to kind of change the way we teach philosophically because of the enormous demands of talking about this complicated, multifactorial issue that is the climate and eco crisis and living sustainably. Okay. So I'm going to speak first about some of the ways I flexed my practice and changed it to address this massive problem. If you've got any questions as we go at all about the terms I'm using or how this applies in practice or any just things that pop into your head, use the chat, please, to ask those questions. And I'm happy to answer as I go or for us to deal with them at the end. So interrupt me by all means. So here are some ways I think environmental inquiry, so talking philosophically about young people about the eco crisis, needs to be flexible. So the climate and eco crisis is an intricate and multifactorial issue. To explore it philosophically requires the grasp of a range of information that will likely go beyond the general knowledge and personal experience of children in the room. It's common in PhD for us to talk about people's personal experiences, but our personal experiences are not enough when you're talking about the climate crisis. You need other forms of knowledge as well. So, as a consequence, we want environmental inquiry to be well informed. That means that the facilitator might need to research the issue before you open up for dialogue, and they might need to increase the knowledge of their children before we can really debate and discuss issues that arise from the climate crisis. So, we can't all just talk in ignorance. The second thing is about balance. So, what I want to say is that the science of global warming and biodiversity loss is not in doubt. That's not what I'm suggesting here, that we treat the science of the climate crisis as if it's all open for debate and we balance it with counter climate denying views or something. I'm not saying that. The science, largely, some of the science about the biodiversity loss and global warming is not in doubt. But the philosophical questions that are raised by the climate crisis, and if you remember, they are questions like this. These questions, is it ever okay to be selfish, for example, they are in doubt. They are contested questions. Some of these questions are so polarizing that children sometimes just inherit the positions of their peers or their parents. So, for example, views about personal travel and diet are often handed down to children culturally from their families or peer groups. And so that means that children of all ages don't always encounter other ways of thinking about these issues. This partiality can really drive polarization. So you can end up having really polarized discussions in environmental inquiry. And so as a consequence, environmental inquiry must really try to facilitate a sense of balance and create the opportunities for us to explore other possible views on some of these contested issues. Sometimes that means that where the children don't raise these views, the facilitator might say, what about this possibility? Or what about that possibility? The facilitator, by the way, is not saying, I think this or you should think that. They're just saying, don't forget these other views. What do you make of those? So that's the balance. Now I'm looking at this third point, to be sensitive to emotions. You don't need me to tell you that the climate and eco crisis is an emotional and unsettling issue for everyone and for children especially. Exploring it philosophically may distress children. It may upset them. Even when it doesn't upset them, it's hard to grasp the significance of what's going on without feeling it and paying attention to children's feelings about it. And this means that philosophical inquiry can't all be in your head. It can't all be cerebral. It needs to be sensitive. It means the facilitator must allow and even encourage a range of emotional responses to hold a space where children can get upset or angry or scared. So start to see these demands are stacking up, right? It's hard to do this work well. And I'm sure you know from your own experiences. And this fourth point, empowering. The emergency is urgent, and the timescales in which we need to act are measured really in months and years rather than in decades and centuries. And while there is a role for talk, dialogue that doesn't think about action can be really hard to defend. So we don't want P4C to just be a talking shop. Children get very irritated by that, and rightly so. So consequently, environmental inquiry must examine what actions are open to people at an individual and also at an institutional and state level. There must be space to unpack justifications, to determine which actions are consistent. To put this another way, environmental inquiry must promote children's agency, but it also needs to take account of the fact that children only have so much agency. That's a difficult thing about being a child. You actually are powerless in some ways, or your power is diminished. And finally, like any big issue, the climate and eco crisis is a topic that some educators, myself included, have got really strong views on. And the strengths of the views that teachers have can increase the temptation that the facilitator leads the students and influences the discussion. You've got to work extra hard in environmental inquiry to not indoctrinate your students. To say, never mind about thinking together and thinking for yourselves, you think what I think, and then we'll finish the discussion. That is always hard for philosophical educators, but it's very tough when you care a lot about the topic, as I do. So one of the things that's attracted me to this topic is the ethical questions around how much I can afford to open up space for dialogue and yet remain as if I was neutral on the topic when I'm not in reality. So there are ways that I think environmental inquiry needs to flex and change to deal with the eco crisis. But there are risks of working in this way, and you may already be thinking of some of them yourself. There is a risk that when you inquire about the environment, the philosophy part of things just gets pushed to the side and we end up just focusing on the facts. That would be a sustainability science lesson or a politics lesson. It wouldn't really be philosophy if we just teach kids the facts. You also think it might be that we really just focus too much on balancing debates or exploring emotions or planning actions or holding back so we don't indoctrinate children. Even if we accept that the climate and eco crisis raises philosophical questions, these risks might raise doubts about whether P4C is the right way forward. Because P4C doesn't normally focus on the facts and on emotions and on debating alternative positions or motivating action. So you might sort of think, wouldn't it be better to do all this stuff a different way? Wouldn't it be better for sustainability education to be direct instruction, a bit of therapy, a debating class, a bit of activism, and then some ideological indoctrination? Why don't you do it? Why don't you do all that stuff? You certainly don't want to make P4C about direct instruction. You don't want P4C to pretend to be therapy. You don't want it to turn into a debating competition where it's all a big game and you're just point scoring. It's not really appropriate for P4C to be about activism, at least not political activism, although it'll inspire activism in some cases. You certainly don't want P4C to be about ideological indoctrination. So we need to be careful when we're doing this that we don't undermine the educational project of teaching children to be philosophers. It's really tough to walk this line between what you want it to be and what the risks are. I hope that you could see a little there. Okay, so I've said that P4C aims to help children think together and to think for themselves. And that's why you don't want this to be instruction, therapy, debating, activism, indoctrination. You want children to talk about this topic, but you want them to learn to think together and to think for themselves. And one of the ways this is achieved is through safeguarding the children's freedom and their responsibility. And this is the respect in which I say P4C should remain the same. It should be steadfast to this commitment to promoting children's freedom and their responsibility. Even when the facilitator like me cares a lot about the topic, even when they have views like kids should be activists actually, they still need to promote the children's freedom and responsibility to grapple with those issues themselves as thinkers and together as a community. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm talking about when I say the kids need to have freedom and they need to have responsibility. Don't be put off by the jargon here. I'll explain what it is that I'm trying to get to in just a second. So I say that children need to be free and responsible in two ways. One is epistemically, one is ethically. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when I say epistemically free, I'm talking about the children as knowers and as learners. And when I say ethically free, I'm talking about the children as beers and actors and human beings, as good or bad people. So my efforts to make children epistemically free, what do they look like? I want them to be free to explore and to evaluate and to answer philosophical questions in ways that fit with evidence and the arguments and their own experience. I don't want them to be constrained by a facilitator or a teacher's plan for the dialogue. I don't want them to be engaged in a game of guessing what the facilitator wants them to say, which often happens in educational encounters where the child is almost saying, "What I'll say whatever you want me to say. What is it?" I want children to be free to share their personal experience without being scared that the group is going to disparage them. I want children to be free to give various positions plenty of consideration. I want them to be free to try on different points of view and then reject them because they were wrong, without a sense that it's wrong to change your mind or that it's wrong to consider unpopular views. I want them to be free to see old problems in new ways, to play with ideas, to make suggestions, to offer solutions. I want them to be free to make mistakes, because when they do make mistakes, they develop a sense of what it really takes to hold a reasonable position. I want them to be free to fully engage in dialogue where the issues remain always open. They must be free to break from the expectation that there's always a settled answer in the end. So I've got quite high hopes for this freedom, this intellectual epistemic freedom, but it's always tempered with responsibility. So when we're having these discussions, they're not a free for all where you can just say any old thing that pops into your head, because you're responsible in these ways as well for what you know and what you learn. So the children in my inquiries, I think they need to be responsible for their opinions. They can't treat facts, for example, the fact that the last decade is likely to have been the hottest in the last 125,000 years. They can't treat that fact as a matter of personal opinion. That's not being epistemically responsible. That's ignoring facts. They can't disregard the testimony of people who are directly affected by the changing climate. They can't just ignore the views of people who are feeling firsthand what's happening. And I'm not just talking about people who are negatively affected by climate change. I'm also talking about people who are affected by anti-climate change measures, like the testimony of fossil fuel workers who fear for their jobs in a low-carbon economy in the future. I want my children to be responsible to reason. I want them to be moved by good reasons to change their mind. I want them to realise their own views are sometimes indefensible and to change them, to let go of them. So that's a form of being responsible. I want them to be responsible to make the right demands epistemically on themselves and other people. I want them to recognise that their perspective is always going to be a bit limited, and they always might be wrong about something. So I hope you can see that I have this sense of being free intellectually and responsible together. That's what I think a community of inquiry should do. And that is a very traditional thing that I think of communities of inquiry about other topics also offers, but it's especially important, I think, in talking about the climate and eco crisis. Now to this other sense of freedom and responsibility, which is about ethical freedom and responsibility. I want participants in the community of inquiry to be ethically free, to respond to philosophical problems in ways that express their real character and their moral commitments. I want them to be free of what they think is the kind of script on certain moral matters. So free enough to not have to say the things they think they're supposed to believe or value. For example, there's a commonly held but really poorly substantiated ethical belief that climate mitigation is all a matter of personal responsibility. I want them to be free to think maybe it's not true. It's all personal responsibility. Maybe it's institutional responsibility, actually. I want them to be free to understand what really matters to them, free enough to speak up or speak out against the expectations of parents, school, church, or state. I want them to be free to never have to espouse views that compromise their ethical integrity. I think children should be free to explore what they feel as well as what they think. I want children to be free to understand the things other people value and care about morally. Free enough to listen to the stories of a wide range of other people within and beyond their own classrooms. When they consider different views on what matters in life, I want them to be free to try on different views without committing to them. To think, this could be really important, I think this is right, actually I've changed my mind. And finally, I want them to be free to criticise the rules of inquiry in the way that we're speaking to each other and to dispute that the work we're doing is worth anything or right. And again, just with the previous one, you don't get to be free without being responsible. So here's the flip side of the coin. I want children to be not just rational, but reasonable. So reasonable is to use rationality, but to also use it with good judgment. I want them to appreciate that power is distributed unequally in the group, just like it is in the world, and that they must be supported to take responsibility for addressing this. That might mean they don't hog the limelight, they don't speak all the time, they amplify the voices of people who are marginalised in the room. I want them to appreciate that their words are powerful and they're not free to say anything at any cost, even if it hurts another person. This responsibility for the power of people and their words, it doesn't just rest with individuals. I want the community to realise that we have to be careful with our words, and I want them to guard the ethos of the inquiry. When we're talking, I want participants to care for each other, to be kind, to be charitable in their interpretation of what other people said, to call out disrespect. Ideally, I want the culture of criticality and creativity and collaboration and care to leak out of the inquiry circle into children's lives outside of the classroom. They should be curious, for example, about why their moral objections to unethical corporations don't translate into acts of boycotting or lobbying, for example. So they should be asking questions about how the environmental inquiry changes what they do or who they are outside in the real world. This is a sort of final consideration before we move to something a bit more real, which is just to kind of hammer this home. In the work that I do, I believe that a facilitator can't tell the children what to believe about philosophical issues around the environment or about anything else. So, of course, I can tell the children to believe facts about the politics, the geography, the science, the chemistry, the physics, but I can't tell them what to believe about those questions that I put up earlier, because those questions are still contested. And I have got strong views about loads of those questions, but I won't tell the children what to believe because I want them to learn to think together and for themselves. And a facilitator also can't tell the participants what to value about the environment or anything else. I want all the kids on one level to care about the environment so much that they change the world, but that's not my role as a philosophical facilitator to persuade them to do that. I want them actually, as an educator, to think really carefully about these issues and to arrive at their own provisional answers. So I hope you can start to see there's a dance between someone who cares about sustainability and someone who cares about philosophy happening here. So I'm going to, in a second, invite you to go into some breakout groups. What you're going to see is a clip of me doing some philosophy with a group of children who are, some of them have been doing philosophy for a long time. Some of them were brand new to this session. They are from the UK, Spain, and Ireland. They are between the ages of about 9 and 14. And I invited them for World Philosophy Day 21, and it was around the time of COP26. I invited them to talk about the environment with me using my form of ethical and environmental inquiry. we spoke for over an hour and a half, these children, and the whole video is available on YouTube, but this is a tiny clip. And what I'm hoping you might do when you look at this clip is to have a look for any concrete evidence of any of this stuff that I've really been talking about, because it's all very well and good to talk about in theory, but it's quite something else to see how we try and weave it together in practice. So quite specifically, these are the things I encourage you. You can talk about anything you like, but if you want a guide, here's some stuff. So I said at the beginning that I'm trying to be steadfast in some ways, stick to how P4C normally operates, and flexible in another way. And so you might look at this clip of these young people and see whether there's any evidence of this. So you could ask the question, do I promote freedom and responsibility in this session? Are these children thinking together or thinking for themselves? Are they not? Am I actually guiding and leading and pushing and pressing? And on the flexibility point, you might ask, I said this inquiry was supposed to be this whole list of stuff. I said it should be informed, balanced, sensitive, empowering, and non-indoctrinatory. Really? Is that happening in the video? Can you see any evidence of that? So that's what I encourage you to look at. But if you find it more interesting to just talk about what you see in an unstructured way, then please do that. I think Mike is going to post in the chat the clip and the particular timestamp for the clip, which is several minutes in. Don't watch the whole thing. And what I encourage you to do is on your own device, I encourage you to watch from 4 minutes 10, just for about however long that is. Just watch that on your own device muted so that you can hear properly. And then after you've watched that for about 8 minutes, if you join your group and you have the discussion that, you know, around those questions or something else that interests you, I think that would be a nice way to spend the time. And when we return, we're going to share some observations, and I can pull out a few teaching points if you'd like. Otherwise, we could just have a free discussion. Okay.
Great, thank you very much, Grace. Lots and lots to think about there. In a moment, we'll be in our breakout rooms. I've put the link to the video in the chat. So if you haven't got the chat open, please do that now. And the 2 questions are there. And I think we're just waiting for the breakout rooms to be presented.
Yes, maybe can we decide about the time when we come back?
I beg your pardon. Yes, I think it's a total of about 30 minutes. Is that right, Grace?
Yeah.
Ok. Posso chiedere a Veronica allora di creare le 2 breakout rooms? So you will be sent to two different breakout sessions, and as usual, Mike and the other tutors will join you and will guide you through this activity. Maybe you can spend a couple of minutes introducing each other if you don't know each other so far. So if you have never met in the past in a breakout rooms, maybe it could be nice. And then on your own, you can watch the video and then discuss together the questions. Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. We've had just over half an hour there. I hope you found it as interesting in your group as we did in group 1. We had a great time discussing the questions and thinking of other questions for Grace. But anyway, I'm going to pass over to you, Grace, now for this the third part.
Yeah, so thank you for still being here, people. What I thought I would do is just elicit any observations or questions initially, and then if you feel there's a sort of need or an interest for me to say a bit more specifically about evidence of these different things that I've been advocating for, then I can give you some more concrete examples myself, and we'll just see what our energy levels are like after we've had an initial discussion. So yeah, I asked you, as you might remember, to look for examples of promoting children's freedom and responsibility in the clip that you saw. I asked whether you thought the children were informed, the discussion was balanced, it was sensitive to their emotions, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering if there is anything anyone would like to raise about what they observed. Feel free to use the chat or to put your hand up if you'd like to come on mic. I'm not sure how you're comfortable doing these things.
I hate the silence, so I break the silence.
Well done.
I'm Brazilian, I speak too much. I cannot stand the silence. In our break room, actually, if I can speak for the group, most of us were quite impressed by the level of the children and the young people participating, meaning that we have the impression exactly that they can behave much better than most of the adults that we know discussing issues, because they were thinking by themselves, but they were actually thinking together as well. Because even if something were in a first view even contradictory, later on with the facilitation, actually we had some complementary point of view. So we had the impression that they were actually building a view of the whole thing. And everybody agreed that the facilitator, your work was very important, very sensible, and not talking over them or giving opinion, but just giving them space to talk and thanking, and or maybe sometimes making a question that would make them think further, not giving an opinion about it. So regarding the first part of the question, I guess we all had a very, we all have the same impression.
It's interesting about the questioning thing, how a philosophical educator asks a question to push the thinking further without pushing the children to think something. So an example might be that I asked the children, do you think that rich people have got more of an opportunity to make a difference than poor people? I could say, don't you think rich people have got more of an opportunity? And it's almost the same question, but it's so different, isn't it? And I'm not pretending that the adults who facilitate this, or indeed the children facilitate, because some children facilitate, don't have a view about, for example, capitalism and the climate crisis. But that's not the point of that in that moment. It's not the educational point. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. What did other people see in the clip, Ryan?
Hi, Grace. So something our group were talking about is we all noticed the enthusiasm of the children and how they're all informed, and most of them had a very informed opinion with concrete examples. And what I think took us a lot by surprise is we compare them to our own students, and some of us are, whether we're in middle school or high school, and our students seem to lack that enthusiasm, but more significantly lack the courage to voice an opinion. So we were wondering, how do you get, maybe with, I imagine with older children, how do you get the room to, to break that ice and to get them to express themselves without, in allowing them to overcome that fear that they may have in a group?
If I may, it was also a question from our break room, like if these children had some kind of preparation before because the way how they also listen to each other and respect their turn and express themselves were quite astonishing.
So some of the children, and so I'll answer the last question first and then the first question last. So some of the children have been were home educated children on that Zoom class, and some of them have been doing philosophy with my colleague Jason Buckley for years, some for a few months, and some were brand new to that class that night. So they were a mixture. Some were school children, some were home educated children, or kind of alternatively educated children. So they were quite a mixture. All of them had done stuff on Zoom before, so they were comfortable with the kind of Zoom forum. One of the things I think is interesting about our mixed group is obviously the few children there who've done philosophy for years have got a massive head start on the culture of dialogue and inquiry. But what I think is interesting is how that culture spreads within a group. So children are quite good at internalizing norms. If I have a class where everyone's brand new to it, I work much harder and for much longer to create the norms of inquiry and the respect. But in a class where several children are already au fait with it, that can spread and be replicated by other children quite quickly. So you wouldn't have been able to spot, I don't think, the children in that group that were new that night. I don't think they're easily spottable. And I think that's because they're internalizing some of the practices that their peers are showing. You see the reverse of this when you have a couple of kind of really disruptive, antagonistic students, not in an intellectually helpful way, but in an unhelpful way, and how that can degrade the culture of a dialogue as well, and it quickly becomes a race to the bottom. So now to Ryan's question about how you get, middle school, high school, older children to just break that feeling of self-consciousness that it takes to express your views. In philosophical inquiry, we use loads of exercises and games to create a community before. So I wouldn't normally start with a new class going, guys, climate crisis, what we're going to do about it? Or, gender politics, racism, the war, the war in Ukraine. We would never start there because you build a community of inquiry first and it takes an awful lot. So in the sense, I've built a community of inquiry with some of these children, even though some were new. So, and I'd also invited them via their parents to talk about the environment for a recorded Zoom session. So I got a slightly odd group of children who children or their parents care about the environment in some way. So they are in some sense not a typical group. But in terms of their ability and experience doing philosophy, they are quite mixed and they're not a super duper expert group of children, unlike others. And to just give you some context, I work with, thousands of children, like I'm sure many of you have in your career, from a whole range of different backgrounds, largely state educated and disadvantaged young people. I'm constantly reassured of children's ability to take talk seriously to each other and respectfully. So they are not outliers in that respect at all, in that young people can do this stuff. But to build them up to it, I'll do things like games like I was playing this game today actually with some people. Disagree with me. We'll put up a kind of a figure on the whiteboard, or we'll have and we'll say this figure. We're going to disagree with them. They're going to make some statements, whatever they are. We're going to work together as a class to just disagree, to find any way to disagree with them possible. Doesn't matter if that's not even what we think. So they're practicing disagreeing without there being anyone on the receiving end who they're worried about hurting. And today we looked at science is objective. That's what the figure said, science is objective. And some people go, how do you argue with that? And then people start to go, well, data can be interpreted in different ways, and funding can be, science can be funded towards getting certain kinds of outcomes, and budgets can constrict what we look at, and every scientist has a subjectivity, and they started to throw loads of objections at this point that they originally thought was kind of uncontroversial. And so I said, look, we've been playing a game, basically. We've been playing a disagreeing game. We're sharpening our skills at disagreeing. Next time, we're going to do some disagreeing in pairs. We're going to be disagreeing with real people. So just building up the intellectual and social comfort with speaking, speaking views that aren't really yours, speaking views that are yours, disagreeing with fake people, disagreeing with real people. And I do a lot of work around celebrating people changing their minds. So, sort of in public life, at least in the UK where I'm from, if a politician changes their mind, it's called a U-turn. They're flip-flopping, it's bad, they don't know what their own policies are, we shouldn't trust them. I think it's brilliant to change your mind. If you were wrong, of course you should change your mind. So in our classes, I get the students often moving around. If you think this, stand here. If you think that, stand there. And when you hear someone say something that changes your mind, just move. And so you see kids in the class moving, and I say, why did you move just then? Oh, because Ryan just said this thing and it made me see things differently. Okay, cool. Well done to everyone who had the confidence to change their mind. So these little elements of pedagogy that you can use in any subject, including sustainability education, can create this culture I'm talking about where it's okay to speak, it's okay to change your mind, it's okay to say something and realize it wasn't right. I hope that helps a bit. I could say more, but it's kind of hard in the abstract to explain.
Yeah, though that was very useful. I especially like the disagree with me game and the changing your mind. Yeah, they're very useful.
Move around physically. I think physically what goes on inside your mind. One of the simplest ways we do it on Zoom is just with thumbs. What do you think about the statement? Show with your thumb, and then we'll have a bit of a dialogue. And I'll say, show thumbs again, and you'll see loads of thumbs have moved often into the middle. And so we say, look, our thought processes are having an impact on people's internal thought process, and even though you can't hear from everybody, it is affecting them because you can see our thumbs have moved. It's just a simple thing, but it's trying to make the invisible visible.
Yeah, thank you. That was very useful.
Are there any other observations that colleagues would like to make about what you saw in the little clip? Did anyone spot the child and his little brother having a wrestling match and the mum having to come in and extract him from the room? I think the clip I offered just starts just after that, but if you want to look at it later, that's quite funny. Very typical of a Zoom session and someone's little brother Zoom bombing. Anyway, anything serious that people saw that they want to observe? If there's not, in that case, would you mind if I just point a few more things out to you? These examples are taken from the wider suite of videos, so they're not things you'll have seen in that clip, but hopefully they'll be ways to make it a bit more concrete what I've been talking about in the talk. Just bear with me. So you might remember that I said I think inquiry should be these things: informed, balanced, sensitive, empowering, not indoctrinatory. I just want to give you a handful of examples of how I've tried to do that. So the first is informed. I really want environmental inquiry to be inclusive. And that means that it can't just be for children who know loads about the eco crisis already. I think that's not. A lot of people, adults I've spoken to, don't want to talk about sustainability because they say I don't know enough about it. So I want to make the barrier for talking about it as low as possible so as many people can join in, but I also don't want us to talk in ignorance to each other. So one of the ways I've done that is I just ensure that I show a wide range of stimuli to the children, and that stimulus shows some of the range of kind of empirical and other sources of information so that the children can get off on the right foot. So for example, we shared this information about successive years of average temperature. But we also shared a wide range, even in just this workshop, a wide range of stimulus. We showed videos of climate experts speaking, campaigning materials from activists, news articles from respected sources. And so taken together, these materials plug some of the knowledge gaps without oversimplifying the situation or reducing the philosophy to just factual information. But you remember I also said that I'm keen for inquiry to be balanced. One of the ways that I achieve that is by layering stimuli, showing different views and also allowing the children to challenge the stimulus they're presented with. So for example, in this video, this is just a still from it. It's an activist video. The children hear from Greta Thunberg, so somebody that's often respected by young, climate-interested young people, talking about planting trees. And in the video, George Monbiot, a British journalist, says the solution to the climate crisis is simple. And he talks about various carbon technologies and activities like tree planting. But one of the first questions I asked the children in the workshop is, are the solutions to the climate crisis simple? So we kind of question the stimulus. And we also question the words of somebody the children's respect, generally speaking, which is Greta Thunberg. So that's one of the ways we sort of pursue balance, by showing that all statements are ripe for interrogation. We don't have to be orthodox about many things in the session. I think that's a way of pretty, respecting the children's epistemic freedom to evaluate claims, but also their responsibility to the evidence on which their judgments sit. Here's another sense about balance, in fact. So here's a bit of text from a transcript of the discussion. So in fact, I think it's here. Yeah. I'll go back slightly, sorry. So here's another way that I promote balance. In the video they watch, George Monbiot talks about what people should be doing about the climate crisis. And I ask the children, why think that young people should be doing anything about the climate crisis? Why think that this massive problem is young people's responsibility? So again, I'm giving them an opportunity to dispute the message that they've been given in the stimulus. It's not because I think it's not children's responsibility or that it is, but I want them to approach even the stimulus with balance and criticality. And here's what they said. So I say, why think that young people should be doing anything to address the climate crisis? Is George Monbiot, the figure in the previous still, is he right to be telling young people what they can do? Daniel says, yes, he is, because young people could still contribute to bad climate. For example, young people are several times more likely to play video games, which takes a lot of power. Then Xanthi says, sorry, but I think that young people have to fix it, meaning the climate crisis, because although we might not have got us into this situation, if we start fixing it now, we'll learn habits, good habits, and those habits will make a big difference. And also, I just want to say that we only have 12 years until climate change will become unstoppable. Just listen to the kids' anxiety bubbling away under the surface. It's really quite moving and quite scary. Then Lucas says, children have to do something, not because they caused it, but because people, young and old, it doesn't matter. All of us are people, and we can do the exact same tasks. So here I think we see the children alert to the ways that they can assume and also reject ethical responsibility based on their prior acts and based on their power and their limited power to make a difference. In establishing these positions, Xanthi and Luca respectfully dispute Daniel's example of children using lots of power to play video games. But they maintain their responsibility that they have the power to do something. And then as Luca starts to argue that age doesn't matter, his voice gets more and more ardent, so you can see kind of the emotion popping through when he makes his argument. And I think what this shows is that these aren't sterile discussions about hypothetical positions. These are dialogues where children are ethically free to respond to the situations in ways that express their authentic character and commitments, but they remain ethically responsible for their true motivations and for the real life consequences of their action or inaction. And just a little something on sensitivity. Luca ends just that last bit with something really rousing and poignant. He's very poetic, this young man, Luca, and this is a very poetic turn of phrase. He says, I still feel like a worm in nothingness that's completely powerless. And can you just see what I say? What can you say to a child who says that? I just say, thank you. I hear that, what you said about feeling powerless. So sometimes in inquiry, all the facilitator can do is not say it's going to be okay, I'll make it better, but just, I hear you. That's that you feel powerless. But not all of the emotion in inquiry is all negative, right? It's not all about how helpless children are. There's also lots of positive stuff about power. I begin the session by getting the children to dig into their sense of agency. And I say to them at the very beginning of the session, tell me about a time that you felt powerful. And this is what Kai says. I think that there was a time when I felt in control. And for example, when I was finally trusted, when I was finally trusted with something, I felt powerful and in control. For example, I felt powerful when I managed my grade 5 ukulele, which is quite a big achievement for me. And I felt like I could do the ukulele and I'd actually achieved something when I got a distinction for it. So the kids are talking about children's experiences of feeling powerful, feeling successful, feeling in control. And so we play with this these sensitivities about powerlessness and power in the session. I show the children this video of the Friday school strikers, and they argue that children should strike from school every Friday until the government does something about climate change. And so I say to the children, do you think that children should be giving up their education for this cause? And Luca says, basically, I don't think so, because you must remember that you're dealing with the government here. The government can always find an alternative solution. For example, just orphaning the kids or something like that. Okay, so he makes a strange comment that maybe the government would be so angry with protesters that he would kill their parents. Okay, it's quite strange and scary. And I could jump straight in and say, no, 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 the government would never do that. It's okay. But I do something else. So I say, oh, I saw Kai's eyes open wide when you said orphaning the kids. I wonder if you could say what you mean. Okay, so just probe for a bit more explanation. And Luca says, well, they would maybe fine the parents or they would send them to prison. And then they would send, so what does it say? They would, basically they would find the parents or they would send them to prison, and then they get the children away, sent somewhere else. So basically he's saying if kids keep striking from school, the parents are getting taken away, the children are getting taken away, the government will clamp down on it. So that's his fear, right? And then Sky says something. So she counters Luca instead of me. She says, if eventually enough people contribute, I think she means to the strikes, school strikes, then they can't put everyone's parents in prison, can they? So rather than intervene with my adult speculations or to correct the children, acting as a facilitator, I try and help the children unpick their various thoughts and feelings that lie behind the view that direct action is too costly. By asking this question that follows, we can see that Luca really mistrusts the adults that are supposed to protect him. So this is what I say, Luca, can I just ask you, do you think the government is so opposed to acting for the climate crisis that it would rather silence parents to stop the kids? Luca says, the government is never nice. It never lets us win. It really doesn't. And then again, another child counters Luca. So I don't have to say, no, 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 Luca, you're wrong. The government would never do that. I just let the dialogue play out and we hear what another child says. And Kai says, I think that, opposed to Luca, I think that the government wouldn't be so extreme as to punish the parents because of their children's independent act. And if they would have punished the parents, then wouldn't they have done that with Greta Thunberg instead of actually listening to her? And so just again, coming back to this sense of children's agency, the children are very interested in powerful young people and what they have been able to get away with. Okay. I'm just going to end with one final thing about freedom and responsibility, and just to give the floor for the final comment to one of the young people. And actually, I produced a paper on this work, which I'll share in the chat. And the paper is called, is based on this quote. He says, I think we should all be part of this because, as Luca says, age doesn't matter. We can all be a part, whether it's planting trees in your garden. In the end, it's our future that's going to be changed. So the children have got a strong sense of what's possible, a strong sense of who they are in this and what they think is right and wrong. And I think that's quite powerful of philosophical inquiry to be able to open up that space for young people. Here's the paper that it's based on, and like I say, I'll share in the chat if anyone is interested in reading that. But thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Grace, for informative but inspiring more than anything, I think. An inspiring session. Great to see children dealing positively with the uncertainty that faces us all. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to announce the next in the series, and I'll put it in the chat as well. So the next webinar is about called Psychology and Climate, Coping with Climate Change, Impacts on Active Citizenship and Mental Well-Being. So that's on the 13th of March and the speaker is Maria Ojala from the University of Oulu in Finland. And I'm just going to put it in the chat. So that's in a couple of weeks, in a month. So looking forward to see you all there. Thank you all very much again. I imagine there will be a little feedback survey coming after this, so it's really important. Please, if you wouldn't mind filling it in. And thanks to the other tutors, and thank you very much, Daniela, and the other colleagues at the University of Trento for organizing this. See you next time. Bye-bye.